Harper Lewis had dealt with condescending gun store employees for 3 years, but today felt different. The bearded clerk behind the counter was openly laughing as she examined a Wilson Combat 45, making jokes to his buddies about little girls playing with daddy's toys. Harper ignored the snickers and picked up the pistol, checking the chamber and inspecting the trigger mechanism with movements that spoke to years of training. That's when Admiral Jonathan Hayes walked through the door, a man she hadn't seen since her classified discharge from Naval Special Warfare 3 years ago. The store went quiet as Hayes watched Harper field strip the weapon in 12 seconds flat, his expression shifting from surprise to recognition to something that made every person in that gun store realize they'd been mocking the wrong woman. Precision Arms was located in a strip mall outside San Diego, the kind of gun store that catered to military personnel and law enforcement professionals who knew quality when they saw it. The walls were lined with rifles, handguns, and tactical accessories that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. It was exactly the kind of establishment where expertise was respected and amateurs were quickly identified and dismissed. Harper Lewis, 27 years old, to the casual observer, she looked like 1,000 other young women in Southern California, unremarkable, non-threatening, and completely out of place in a high-end firearms store. What none of the employees at Precision Arms knew was that Harper Lewis was officially dead, killed in action during a classified naval special warfare operation in Syria 3 years earlier. Her death had been reported to her family, her service record had been sealed, and her identity had been buried so deep that even military intelligence databases showed no trace of her existence. The truth was more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. Harper had been Lieutenant Commander Harper "Phantom" Lewis, one of only 3 women ever to complete the Navy's most classified training program, a selection course that made SEAL training look like basic fitness instruction. The program, officially designated as Maritime Special Operations Group, but known simply as the Unit among those with appropriate clearances, trained operatives for missions that couldn't be acknowledged by any government agency. She'd served for 5 years in operations across 4 continents, eliminating high-value targets and gathering intelligence in situations where conventional military or intelligence personnel would have been ineffective. Her psychological profile indicated exceptional resilience. Her tactical skills were rated among the top 1% of all special operations personnel, and her marksmanship scores were legendary even among communities where precision shooting was a basic job requirement. The operation that had officially killed her had actually been a success, the elimination of a Syrian arms dealer who'd been supplying advanced weapons to terrorist organizations throughout the Middle East. But the mission had been compromised by intelligence leaks, and Harper's extraction had required her to disappear permanently to protect both operational security and her own life. For 3 years, she'd been living under a new identity in San Diego, working as a freelance security consultant and trying to build a normal life from the ashes of a career that had consumed her 20s. The transition from elite warrior to suburban civilian had been more challenging than any mission she'd ever undertaken. The psychological adjustment was the hardest part. Harper had spent her adult life in environments where her skills were valued, where her judgment was trusted, and where her capabilities were respected by colleagues who understood what it meant to operate at the highest levels of military professionalism. In civilian life, she was just another young woman whose competence was questioned, whose knowledge was dismissed, and whose presence in traditionally male environments was treated as an intrusion. Gun stores were particularly challenging. Harper's cover identity required her to maintain proficiency with firearms, both for personal protection and for consulting work that occasionally required armed security services. But every purchase became an ordeal of condescension, mansplaining, and assumptions about her knowledge and experience. Today's visit to Precision Arms had started like dozens of others. Harper needed to replace her backup sidearm, a compact pistol that could be carried concealed but still deliver the stopping power necessary for personal defense. The Wilson Combat 45 she was examining represented the pinnacle of handgun engineering, custom manufactured, precision fitted, and capable of accuracy that exceeded the abilities of most shooters. You sure you can handle something with that much recoil, sweetheart? Asked Derek, the bearded clerk who'd been watching her examination of the pistol with obvious amusement. His two colleagues behind the counter were grinning as they waited for Harper's response to what they clearly considered friendly teasing. Harper had learned that engaging with such comments only made situations worse. She continued her inspection of the Wilson Combat, checking the trigger pull weight, examining the sight alignment, and testing the slide action with the methodical thoroughness that had been drilled into her during years of weapons training. Maybe you should try something a little more appropriate, suggested Mike, another employee who'd joined the conversation. He gestured toward a display case containing smaller caliber pistols in bright colors that were obviously marketed toward women. These are much easier to handle, and they come in pink. The laughter that followed was loud enough to attract attention from other customers in the store. Harper felt her jaw clench involuntarily, a stress response she'd worked hard to control during her transition to civilian life. In her previous career, disrespect from colleagues would have been inconceivable. Here, it was routine. "I'm fine with the .45, Harper replied quietly, continuing her examination. The Wilson Combat felt familiar in her hands, similar to weapons she'd carried on missions where precision and reliability meant the difference between completing objectives and coming home in a body bag. "Lady, do you even know what you're looking for?" asked Derek, his tone shifting from amusement to irritation. "That's a serious weapon for serious people. It's not some fashion accessory you show off at the range on weekends." Harper looked up from the pistol, her green eyes meeting Derek's gaze directly. For just a moment, her expression carried the cold focus that had made her one of the military's most effective operators. But she caught herself and returned to the bland civilian demeanor that had become her protective camouflage. "I know what I'm looking for," she said simply. That's when the front door chimed and Admiral Jonathan Hayes walked into Precision Arms. Hayes was exactly as Harper remembered him. Tall, silver-haired, and carrying himself with the quiet authority that came from commanding the world's most elite warriors. At 58, he looked like Central Casting's idea of a senior military officer, distinguished, competent, and absolutely comfortable in any environment where life-or-death decisions were routine. What Harper didn't expect was the shock of recognition that crossed his face when their eyes met across the gun store. For 30 seconds, neither of them moved. Hayes stared at a woman who was supposed to be dead, while Harper calculated the implications of being discovered by the one person who knew exactly who she used to be. "Phantom 6, Hayes said quietly, using Harper's operational call sign from missions that would remain classified for the next 50 years. The gun store fell completely silent. Derek and his colleagues stopped laughing, suddenly aware that something significant was happening but lacking the context to understand what they were witnessing. Harper set down the Wilson Combat carefully, her movements precise and controlled despite the adrenaline surge that came with being discovered after 3 years of careful anonymity. "Admiral," she replied, her voice steady and professional despite the circumstances. Hayes approached slowly, his expression cycling through surprise, concern, and what appeared to be relief. "I thought the report said—" "The reports were accurate as far as they needed to be," Harper interrupted gently. "May I suggest we continue this conversation elsewhere?" But Hayes wasn't ready to leave. His eyes had shifted to the Wilson Combat that Harper had been examining, and he was processing the implications of finding one of his former operators shopping for precision firearms in a civilian gun store. "Were you planning to purchase that weapon?" he asked. "I was considering it before I was interrupted," Harper replied, glancing meaningfully at Derek and his colleagues, who were watching this exchange with growing confusion. Hayes picked up the pistol that Harper had set aside, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who'd been evaluating weapons and warriors for 3 decades. His inspection was brief but thorough: trigger pull, sight alignment, slide action, and overall condition. "Excellent choice," he said, setting the weapon back on the counter, "though I suspect your evaluation was more thorough than mine." He turned to Derek, who'd been watching this interaction with obvious bewilderment. "This woman was examining your Wilson Combat. I assume you were providing appropriate customer service?" Derek's confident demeanor had evaporated completely. The presence of a senior military officer and the strange dynamic between him and the young woman had created a situation that was clearly beyond his experience. We were just... she seemed like she might be in over her head with something that powerful, Derek stammered. Hayes's expression didn't change, but something in his posture conveyed disapproval that made Derek take an involuntary step backward. In over her head, Hayes repeated slowly, with a .45 caliber pistol. He looked at Harper, his expression mixing professional respect with what might have been amusement. Would you mind demonstrating your familiarity with this weapon system? Harper understood immediately what Hayes was asking. This wasn't about purchasing a firearm. It was about education, the kind of education that Derek and his colleagues desperately needed. Of course, sir, Harper replied. What happened next took exactly 12 seconds and left everyone in Precision Arms completely silent. Harper picked up the Wilson Combat and immediately began field stripping the weapon with movements that were so fluid and precise that they seemed choreographed. Slide removal, barrel extraction, spring compression, and complete disassembly were accomplished with the kind of muscle memory that only came from thousands of repetitions under high-stress conditions. She didn't look at the weapon during disassembly. Her hands moved automatically while her eyes remained focused on Derek's face, watching his expression change from condescension to confusion to something approaching respect. The reassembly was equally impressive. Every component returned to its proper position with mechanical precision, the slide slammed home with perfect timing, and the functions check was completed with movements that spoke to years of professional training. When Harper finished, she set the fully assembled pistol on the counter and looked at Derek expectantly. "Any other questions about my familiarity with the weapon system?" she asked quietly. Derek and his colleagues were staring at her with expressions that mixed embarrassment with dawning realization. The woman they'd been mocking had just demonstrated weapons handling skills that exceeded anything they'd seen from civilian customers and most of their law enforcement clients. Admiral Hayes stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the store employees directly, "you've just witnessed a demonstration of weapons proficiency by one of the most capable operators I've ever had the privilege to command. Her expertise with firearms exceeds that of most military professionals, and her tactical capabilities are classified at levels you don't have clearance to discuss." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "I suggest that in the future, you evaluate customers based on their demonstrated knowledge rather than your assumptions about their backgrounds. This woman could teach firearms courses that would challenge your most experienced instructors." The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute. Derek, Mike, and their colleagues were processing the implications of having spent the afternoon mocking someone whose qualifications apparently exceeded their own by orders of magnitude. "Ma'am," Derek said finally, his voice carrying genuine contrition, "I apologize for our behavior. We were out of line, and you deserve better treatment than what you received here." Harper nodded acknowledgement but didn't respond verbally. The damage had been done, and apologies couldn't undo the hours of condescension and disrespect she'd experienced. Admiral Hayes handled the business transaction with the efficiency that characterized all his interactions. The Wilson Combat was purchased, along with accessories and ammunition that Harper would need for maintaining proficiency with the weapons system. Payment was processed without further commentary from the chastened store employees. As they prepared to leave, Hayes addressed the staff one final time. "This woman is a national asset whose service to this country involves sacrifices you cannot imagine," he said quietly. "She deserves your respect, your courtesy, and your gratitude. I trust that future interactions will reflect an understanding of these facts." The parking lot conversation that followed was the first time Harper had spoken with anyone who knew her true background since her extraction from Syria 3 years earlier. The weight of maintaining her cover identity had been more isolating than she'd realized, and talking with someone who understood her capabilities and service record felt like a form of therapy. "How did you find me?" Harper asked as they walked toward their vehicles. I didn't, Hayes replied. I was purchasing ammunition for a training exercise when I saw you handling that Wilson combat. Your weapons manipulation was distinctive. There aren't many people who move with that kind of precision. Harper smiled for the first time in months. I thought I'd gotten better at blending in with civilians. Your tactical skills are intact, Hayes observed, but suppressing them requires conscious effort that shows in subtle ways. To most people, you probably seem completely normal. To someone who's trained operators for 30 years, you stand out like a neon sign. They reached Harper's car, a nondescript sedan that provided reliable transportation without attracting attention. Hayes examined the vehicle with professional interest, noting modifications that weren't visible to casual observers, but that spoke to ongoing security concerns. Are you satisfied with civilian life? Hayes asked directly. The question Harper had been avoiding for 3 years hung in the air between them. She'd been telling herself that adjustment was just a matter of time, that eventually she'd find fulfillment in a normal life with normal challenges and normal relationships. But encounters like today's reminded her that she was fundamentally different from the people around her, shaped by experiences that couldn't be shared or explained. I'm trying to be, she answered honestly. Hayes nodded, understanding the subtext of her response. The transition from operational status to civilian life is challenging for everyone, but particularly difficult for personnel with your level of training and experience. The skills that made you exceptional in our community don't necessarily translate to civilian environments. I've noticed, Harper said dryly. There are alternatives, Hayes continued. Opportunities that would allow you to use your capabilities in service to your country without requiring you to maintain a completely false identity. Harper felt her pulse quicken. For 3 years, she'd assumed that her operational career was permanently over, that the skills she'd spent decades developing would slowly atrophy through disuse. The possibility that alternatives existed was both exciting and terrifying. What kind of opportunities? She asked. The kind we shouldn't discuss in a parking lot outside a gun store, Hayes replied. Are you interested in hearing more? Harper looked at the Wilson combat in her hands, a weapon that represented both her past capabilities and her current isolation. The morning's encounter had crystallized something she'd been avoiding. She wasn't meant for normal life, and trying to force herself into civilian patterns was slowly destroying the person she'd worked so hard to become. I'm interested, she said. The meeting that changed Harper's life took place 3 days later in a conference room at the Naval Special Warfare Compound in Coronado. The facility was familiar territory. She'd spent months there during her initial training, learning skills that had defined her adult identity before everything changed in Syria. Admiral Hayes was present, along with 2 other individuals whose credentials Harper recognized immediately. Dr. Sarah Chen was a psychologist who specialized in transitioning special operations personnel back to active duty after traumatic incidents. Commander James Mitchell was a planning officer whose expertise in classified operations made him one of the most valuable personnel in naval special warfare. Before we begin, Hayes said, I want to emphasize that everything we discuss is voluntary. You're under no obligation to consider any proposals we present, and declining would have no impact on your current situation or future security. Harper nodded her understanding while mentally preparing for possibilities she'd stopped allowing herself to imagine. Dr. Chen opened the discussion with an assessment that demonstrated thorough knowledge of Harper's background and current circumstances. Your psychological profile indicates exceptional resilience and adaptability, but also shows signs of isolation and unfulfillment that are common among highly trained personnel attempting to integrate into civilian communities. The skills that made you effective in operational environments don't disappear simply because you've changed careers, Commander Mitchell added, but suppressing those capabilities indefinitely isn't psychologically sustainable for someone with your training and experience. Hayes leaned forward, his expression serious but encouraging. We're developing a new program that would allow personnel like you to serve their country while maintaining the civilian identities that protect both operational security and personal safety. It's not a return to your previous career, but it would utilize your capabilities in ways that civilian consulting cannot. The program Hayes described was unlike anything Harper had encountered during her military service. Officially, it didn't exist. Personnel assigned to it maintained civilian identities and careers while being available for specific missions that required their unique combinations of skills and security clearances. Think of it as a reserve component for special operations, Dr. Chen explained. You would continue your current life and work, but with the knowledge that you're serving a greater purpose when called upon. What kind of missions? Harper asked. Commander Mitchell consulted classified documents before responding. Intelligence gathering in situations where conventional personnel would be ineffective. Personal protection for high-value individuals. Elimination of specific threats to national security, the kinds of operations where your particular skills and background would be decisive factors. The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering operational security, legal protections, compensation structures, and psychological support systems that would help Harper maintain balance between her civilian identity and her operational responsibilities. The most important factor, Hayes emphasized, is that this would be a choice you make freely, with full understanding of the implications and commitments involved. We're not trying to recreate your previous career. We're offering an evolution that addresses both national security needs and your personal fulfillment. Harper left the meeting with detailed materials to review and 30 days to make her decision. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like the path forward might lead somewhere that honored both who she'd been and who she was becoming. The decision process involved careful consideration of risks, benefits, and long-term implications that went far beyond simple career choices. Harper's civilian life provided safety and anonymity, but it also meant suppressing the capabilities that had defined her identity for over a decade. The program Hayes had described offered a middle ground that could provide purpose without requiring her to abandon the security she'd built over 3 years of careful identity construction. More importantly, it would allow her to serve her country again in ways that matched her training and experience. The skills that made her an awkward fit for civilian environments would once again become valuable assets in service to national security objectives. Harper's answer came exactly 29 days after her meeting with Admiral Hayes. She was ready to serve again, but on terms that respected both her capabilities and her need for a sustainable long-term identity. The reintegration process took 6 months and involved training programs that updated her skills while preparing her for the unique challenges of operating under deep cover in civilian environments. Unlike her previous career, this program emphasized blending operational readiness with normal life patterns in ways that would be sustainable indefinitely. Her cover identity remained intact. She was still Harper Lewis, security consultant, living quietly in San Diego. But now she was also Phantom 6, one of a small number of operatives who could be called upon when national security required capabilities that couldn't be provided through conventional channels. The first mission came 8 months after her recruitment into the program. Intelligence had identified a North Korean arms dealer operating through a network of California businesses, selling advanced weapons technology to buyers throughout the Middle East. The operation was too sophisticated for conventional law enforcement, but not significant enough to justify official military action. Harper's assignment was straightforward: infiltrate the dealer's organization, gather evidence of illegal weapons transfers, and eliminate the threat through whatever means proved most effective. It was exactly the kind of mission that had defined her previous career, but now she could return to her civilian life afterward instead of disappearing into another operational assignment. The mission's success demonstrated that her skills remained sharp despite 3 years of civilian life. More importantly, it proved that the program Hayes had described could provide the kind of meaningful work that matched her capabilities while allowing her to maintain the personal life she'd built in San Diego. 2 years later, Harper Lewis was still living her double life with a satisfaction that had been missing during her purely civilian period. Her security consulting business provided legitimate income and professional fulfillment, while her classified assignments offered the kind of challenges that utilized her full range of capabilities. The gun store incident that had led to her recruitment became a reminder of how much her life had changed. She still encountered condescension and assumptions about her knowledge, but now those encounters were temporary inconveniences rather than daily reminders of how poorly her skills translated to civilian environments. At Precision Arms, Derek and his colleagues had become respectful and professional in their interactions with Harper. Word had spread through the local firearms community that she was someone whose expertise exceeded appearances, and her recommendations were sought by customers who needed advice about weapons and tactics. "You know," Derek said during one of her visits, "we still don't know exactly what your background is, but Admiral Hayes made it clear that we were out of line that day. I want you to know that we've changed how we treat all our customers, not just you." Harper smiled, remembering the condescension she'd faced during her early civilian years. "People aren't always what they appear to be," she replied. "It's better to assume competence until proven otherwise." The wisdom of that approach had been proven repeatedly in Harper's new career. The most dangerous opponents were often the ones who appeared least threatening, and the most valuable assets were sometimes the people that others overlooked or underestimated. Admiral Hayes visited Harper's office occasionally, ostensibly for security consulting that provided cover for their operational relationship. During one such visit, he reflected on the success of the program that had given Harper a second career. "You were right to be skeptical initially," he said. "Balancing operational readiness with civilian life requires psychological flexibility that not everyone possesses. But for personnel like you, it's provided a sustainable path forward that serves both personal and national interests." Harper had found the balance that had eluded her during her purely civilian years. She was serving her country again, but in ways that allowed her to maintain relationships and interests outside the insular world of special operations. The skills that had made her exceptional as a naval officer were now deployed in service to missions that utilized those capabilities without consuming her entire identity. The transformation from Lieutenant Commander Harper "Phantom" Lewis to Harper Lewis, security consultant and classified operative, represented more than just a career change. It was an evolution that honored both her service record and her need for a life that extended beyond military objectives. Standing in her office overlooking San Diego Bay, Harper could see naval special warfare facilities where she'd once trained for missions that would remain classified indefinitely. But now she could also see the civilian community where she'd built relationships and interests that provided balance to the high-stakes world of special operations. The woman who'd been ridiculed at a gun store for examining weapons she could use better than the people mocking her had found a place where her capabilities were valued without defining her completely. Sometimes the most effective warriors were the ones who looked exactly like everyone else, and the most important battles were fought by people whose true identities would never be revealed. Harper Lewis had learned to be both the civilian security consultant who lived quietly in San Diego and the elite operative who served her country in ways that couldn't be acknowledged. The balance wasn't always easy to maintain, but it provided the kind of meaningful work and personal fulfillment that had been missing from both her purely military and purely civilian careers. In the end, Admiral Hayes had been right. The most dangerous weapons were often the ones that nobody expected to be dangerous. Harper Lewis was living proof that appearances could be completely deceiving, and that the most effective protection came from guardians who looked exactly like the people they'd sworn to protect. The gun store incident had been a catalyst for changes that went far beyond her individual circumstances. Harper's story had influenced military policies about transitioning special operations personnel, leading to programs that helped elite warriors find meaningful civilian careers without completely abandoning their specialized capabilities. Sometimes the most important battles were fought by people whose true identities would remain forever classified. On her most recent visit to Precision Arms, Harper had witnessed a familiar scene, a young female Marine veteran being condescended to by a new employee who hadn't learned the lessons Derek and his team had absorbed years earlier. Without hesitation, Harper had intervened, quietly demonstrating the veteran's expertise to the shocked clerk while ensuring the woman received the respect her service deserved. "Thank you," the veteran had said afterward, her relief evident. "I know exactly how that feels." Harper had simply smiled and handed the woman her business card. "If you ever need work in the security field, call me. People with your background are exactly what this industry needs." It was a small act of mentorship, but it represented something larger that Harper had learned over the years. True strength wasn't just about individual capability, but about lifting others who'd walked similar paths. The program that had given her a second chance was now helping dozens of other former operators find meaning in civilian life while still serving their country. Standing in the parking lot outside Precision Arms, Harper reflected on how far she'd come from that afternoon when Admiral Hayes had changed her life forever. She was no longer the isolated former operative, struggling to find her place in a world that didn't understand her. She was a bridge between two worlds, helping others navigate the same challenging transition she'd overcome. The quiet victories were often the most important ones, and Harper Lewis had learned to find satisfaction in battles that would never make headlines, but changed lives nonetheless. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, you can subscribe to see more incredible stories like this one.